Welcome to this session of the course Economic Environment and Business Strategy. Today, we focus on a vital macroeconomic indicator that significantly shapes business decisions and economic policy. Is called inflation. Inflation reflects the rate at which the general price level in an economy change over time. It influences purchasing power, cost structure, and financial planning all across all sectors of the economy. So in this section, more specifically, we will explore what inflation is and why it matters. And then subsequently, we'll discuss the key methods used to measure inflation, including GDP deflator, consumer price index, wholesale price index, and producer price index. We will use simple examples and practical data to understand how these measures work and how they are used to monitor inflation trends in India and globally. Let's begin by unpacking the concept of inflation and then dwell into how it's measured through these four methods. So beginning with what is inflation is all about. So how do we measure prices? So we need to make a distinction between price and price level. And a price is the cost of an individual good or service. For example, when we refer rupees 40 for a liter of milk, that is an individual price. When it comes to price level, that is the average of prices across a broad basket of goods and services in the economy. So more further, why it matters? In macroeconomics, we don't track individual prices because in macroeconomics, we are dealing with aggregate indicators. So here we track the overall trends in prices. To do this, we use price indices such as consumer price index, wholesale price index, GDP deflators, and others. So in this context, let's start with defining what is inflation. So inflation is the rate at which the overall price level increases over time. It tells us how fast purchasing power is falling or prices are increasing. So then to make a distinction between inflation and price level is like the current position on a hill, and inflation is how steeply you are climbing that hill. So today's price level reflects the cumulative effect of past inflation. Let's now move to understanding inflation more formally. First of all, what is inflation? The definition for inflation is defined as the rate of change in the overall price level over time. So here, inflation is the rate of change of prices. So for example, here when we say the definition here, this is the inflation, and what does it mean? That PT is today's price in this year, current year, and suppose we want to measure the price as compared to previous year. Suppose T is, for example, period 2025, and PT minus 1, you know that then PT minus 1 is equal to 2024. Then for this ratio formula, we calculate inflation as the today's price, that the price in 2025 minus price in 2024 divided by the price in 2024. So what we mean here is that the price, especially this P, is not individual price. Instead, we will be computing a price index by aggregating all the prices, all the goods and services in an economy. Then we get the price index. So here the P means actually not individual price. Instead, this one is price index. So when we see, when we get the inflation rate is greater than 0, that means prices are increasing. We mean there is inflation. So when this inflation rate is less than 0, we call that the prices are decreasing or we are in a deflationary stage. So alternative form of estimating the price, for example, the price index for this year, for example 2025, is equal to price index in the previous year plus the previous year, that the 2024, times the inflation. Inflation normally we express in terms of percentage. For example, when we say inflation is 7%, like that, in this way we say 7%, or otherwise this one is 0.7. So, to summarize this slide, today's price is last period price adjusted for inflation. So, let's now move to how inflation has been measured. So, there are 4 key indices that have been widely used. So, inflation is measured using different indices depending on what prices are being tracked and whose perspective is considered, whether it's of consumer or producer or economy wide. So, here we use 4 major indices. One is called GDP deflator, second one is called consumer price index, the third one is called wholesale price index, and the fourth one is called producer price index. So, let's move to one by one. What is meant by GDP deflator first to begin with? And the GDP deflator is one of the broadest measure of inflation. It captures price changes in all final goods and services produced domestically. So, in the GDP definition, we have defined that GDP is the market value of, we categorically mentioned that all final goods and services produced in the domestic territory of a country in a given period of time, maybe 1 quarter or 1 year. So, the formula which is being used for estimating GDP deflator is the real GDP divided by nominal GDP times 100. So, what is meant by nominal GDP? We already discussed in the previous session that nominal GDP measures the value of output in a given period using the prices of that period. Suppose when we are calculating GDP in 2025 using the 2025 price, that is the nominal GDP in 2025. And if suppose the GDP of 2020 is calculated using the price of 2020, that is the nominal GDP of 2020. So, here it measures the value of the output at the current market prices. So, in that way, we know that we already know this. That means in the previous session, we have seen that it reflects the changes in both prices and quantities. So, if prices rise due to inflation, nominal GDP may increase even if output stays constant. So, then coming to the real GDP measures changes in physical output by valuing goods at prices from a base year. So, it measures output at a constant prices. For example, that is adjusted for inflation. So, that means if the 2025 GDP, we are using 2020 as the base year, then we are getting 2025 GDP, we convert into real GDP, but at the base price of 2020. So, that means then we can easily calculate the GDP of 2020 with 2025. So, it reflects changes in the actual volume of production. So, it enables the comparison of economic performance over time without price distortions. So, this is why the distinction matters, because it helps us distinguishing between price level changes and real economic growth. So, the formula we have already seen that the GDP deflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So, let us, using an illustrative example, let us see how to calculate GDP deflator. So, first I am showing you the year, the GDP in 2023 and 2024. Assume that in this economy we have only 2 products. One is rice and the other one is apple. And this economy in 2023, they produced 500 kilogram of rice and 150 kilograms of apple. And the price in 2023, rice per kilo was 10 and apple per kilo was 20. And in 2024, after 1 year, we are calculating GDP in that year, that the 2024 GDP. At that time, you can see there is a marginal increase in the quantity of rice produced. In the previous year, we produced 500. This year, the production was 510. And similarly, apple also there is only a marginal increase in the production. Last year production was 150 and this year production was 160. From there, looking at this itself, you can see that there is a nominal economic growth. Actually, as compared to previous year and this year, they have been producing more of rice and more of apple, though is very low amount in magnitude. But at the same time, what I did that in 2024, in the illustrative example, I deliberately doubled the price. See, for example, rice, it was last year it was 10, this year 20. And similarly, apple price, it was 20 in 2023, and in 2024 we doubled, and is going to be, it becomes 40 now. Suppose if you are calculating GDP, how CSO calculate? Suppose when they are calculating GDP in 2023, they use the quantity of 2023 and the price of 2023 itself. That means when CSO calculates, in fact, they directly calculate nominal GDP. So they calculate nominal GDP in 2023, and when in 2024 they calculate nominal GDP of 2024, that using the quantity of 2024 and the price of 2024. So based on this, let us see the estimation of nominal GDP. So you know that the nominal GDP in 2024, you can say straightforward calculate it, that for example here rice contribution is 500 times 10 and apple contribution is 150 times 20. Similarly, 2024 also you can calculate the respective quantity of that product times the price of that product. Accordingly, you will get the nominal GDP in each year. So from this, using that, you can see the nominal GDP of 2023 is 8,000 and nominal GDP in 2024 is 16,600. So by looking at, you can see that the nominal GDP has increased more than 100 times. It's more than double. So you can see that there is a increase in nominal GDP. But the issue here is that any change in nominal GDP, you know that the quantity, there is a marginal increase in the quantity produced. For example, rice, you can see that from 500, it became 510. But the price, we have deliberately doubled it. So you can see the first part is obviously there is slight increase in the quantity produced. At the same time, you can see that there is also a change in prices as well. So the nominal GDP, when it become 8,000 to 16,600, it reflects two things. One is change in real GDP and the second one is change in due prices. So when using the inflation, what we want to do that, we need to know that using this one, how much is the changes in price here. So from this, in order to calculate the real GDP, so real GDP of 2024, suppose in 2024, what we get, as I already mentioned you, CSO directly calculate nominal GDP. Then if they want to convert this one, the 2024 nominal GDP into real GDP, using all these quantities same, using the base year of 2023, now they should multiply this quantity with this quantity with this price, this quantity with this price. So you can see here is that 510 multiplied with the rice price. The 510, this is the quantity produced in 2024 and 10 is the price in 2023. Similarly, 160 the quantity produced in 2024, 20 is the price of apple produced in 2023. So we are using the quantity, for example 2024, briefly we use the quantity of 2024 but the price we use of 2023. So when we calculate this one, what you are getting is that the real GDP in 2024 at 2023 prices is going to be 8,300. But what the nominal GDP we got? 16,600. Actually, the real GDP growth was only from 8,000, it became 8,300. The remaining amount what we saw here is just because increase in the price level, because we doubled the price level deliberately in this table. So from this, calculating the GDP deflator, we do it by in this way: nominal GDP in 2024 divided by the real GDP of 2024 using 2023 prices times 100. So when you do this, what you are going to get that here, you got 200. 200 is the GDP deflator. So in the base year, GDP deflator is always 100. That means when you calculate GDP deflator, that the nominal GDP of, suppose in 2023, if you use the nominal GDP of 2023 and the real GDP of also of 2023, that means one and same. So when you divide, you are going to get 1. So that means 100 when you are multiplying with 100. So in the base year, we always get GDP deflator is always 100. So here 200 we got. In this case here we got 200. So in order to get the GDP deflator, we need to subtract the, finally to get the inflation, we need to subtract 100 from here. So to summarize here, GDP deflator is the nominal GDP in period T divided by the real GDP in period T times 100. So what we have done here is that by using the concept called nominal GDP and real GDP, we calculated the GDP deflator, and GDP deflator here is a measure of inflation. So here what you can see that when you look the individual prices in 2023 and also the individual prices of 2024, so you can see that the prices has doubled. It has increased 100 times. So here using the formula, the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP, the value that you are getting, that is the measure of inflation. So this is one of the broadest measure of inflation, that is called GDP deflator. Then let's now move to the another measure, that is called consumer price index. So consumer price index, it measures inflation faced by households. It tracks price changes in a fixed basket of consumer goods and services. The formal definition here is that it measures the cost of buying a fixed basket of goods and services representative of the purchases of the consumers. So the methodology involved here is stepwise. First, we survey consumers to determine composition of the typical consumer's basket of goods and services. And every month, collect data on prices of all items in the basket, then compute the cost of basket in that particular month. In each and every month, we collect the data on prices of all items in that basket, then accordingly compute the cost of basket. Then we calculate CPI, Consumer Price Index, in any month. This is going to be equal to the cost of basket in that month. For example, we are calculating the cost of basket in the month of December. Suppose December 2025 is the cost of basket. Then we calculate what is the cost of the same basket. For example, the base year is, for example, January 2025. Suppose this is the base year. So what we do that, then we multiplied it with the 100. Then the value what we are getting is the CPI. Suppose let us say, in order to get a better clarity of the concept, let us use one illustrative example. Suppose that a typical consumer buys 20 apples and 10 oranges every month. This is a brave assumption. Actually, the consumer buy only 2 commodity, but just for the sake of simplicity and just for the sake of ease of calculation, we assume that a typical consumer, for example, we are assuming that a consumer buys only 20 apples and 10 oranges every month. Then the consumer basket consists of 20 apples and 10 oranges. So then how to calculate CPI in 2025 with the 2024 base year? So in this case, how we calculate, this is the formula, that the 20 is the quantity of apple, and the apple at the current prices of 2025, what is the current price of apple in 2025, and also calculate the quantity of orange and the price of orange in the current price of 2025, divided by same quantity used, that the 20 apples, but what is the price? Price we take the base year, that is the 2024 price, and similarly quantity of orange, but the quantity of orange is same, but the price that we are taking is what was the price of one orange in 2024 multiplied by 100. So this is the formula. So let us present this one in a table to get a better grip of the concept. So our example, the typical consumer basket contains 20 apples and 10 oranges. So let us take the year starting from 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. So important thing to remember here is that the quantity, the consumer basket remains same throughout the year. We are not going to change it. So the quantity remains same, but the price of apple and price of orange, it changes. So you can see the price of apple over the year, it changes from 10, 11, 12 and 13, and orange also in the first year it was 15. Next year also there is no change, and there is an increase in 22, but there is a decline in 23. So now, using the steps that we just discussed, let us first calculate the cost of basket in each year. So then we need to calculate the CPI. From that we can calculate the price change. So for each year you need to calculate the cost of the basket, and the CPI use 2000 as the base year. So we are going to use 2000 as the base year. Then the price change from the preceding year. To calculate that, just complete this procedure, that is cost of basket, multiply this with the quantity, and quantity times price in the respective year. So you know that in 2000, in order to buy the typical by this basket of 20 apples and 10 oranges, the consumer has to pay 350. Next year, because there is an increase in price, changes in price, there is the cost of basket become 370. Then the subsequent year 2022 it becomes 400, and in 2023 it becomes 410. So this is the cost of buying this basket in the respective years. Then how to calculate the CPI here? CPI, in order to calculate, you need to divide the cost of basket in that particular. Suppose you want to calculate the CPI in 2000. If you want to calculate here, you calculate what is the CPI in that year, price, and the base year. So here base year also we have taken the 2000 itself. So you can see that the cost of basket in 23 is 350 in the year 2000, and since we are taking 2000 as the base year, the cost of basket is same. So what you are going to get is 350 divided by 350 times 100. You are going to get 100. It also says that in the base year we always get 100 as the CPI, the price index. So in the subsequent year, the cost of basket 2001 divided by the cost of basket in year 2000, and that you are going to get 105.7. Cost of basket in buying in 2002 is 400. Then the cost of basket in 2000 is 350. Then you are going to get this is the cost of basket in 2002. So accordingly you will also get the CPI in 2003 is 117.1. So what we have done here in the CPI calculation is that by measure the cost of basket in that particular year divided by the cost of basket in the base year times 100. So from this, how to calculate inflation? So here you need to recall the formula for calculating inflation. So this one is the price current year divided by the previous year price index. So here this P means, this P is nothing but CPI in respective year. Okay, so this is the CPI. So then how to calculate the inflation? So inflation has been calculated in that way, that the CPI this way, the CPI in the current year minus CPI in the previous year divided by CPI in the previous year. So accordingly you can see that, for example, the annual rate of inflation rate in 2002 as compared to 2001 is 8.1. So this is the formula. So you just use the CPI of 2002, that is the P, price level, minus the CPI of 2001 divided by the CPI of 2001 times 100. So similarly, applying the same formula, you will get this, the inflation in 2003 is going to be 2.5. Suppose you are getting this kind of table. Here we are not defining any cost basket. We are not defining any consumer basket. Suppose if you are not defining any consumer basket, but we are given the quantity of each item and the price of each item in the respective years. From this year, you need to assume one of the year as the base year, and that year you need to take, using that quantity, you need to define the consumer basket. Suppose if you want to take here, the question is, suppose using 2023 as the base year, what is the appropriate inflation rate in 2024? So in this case, what you need to do that, you need to calculate, use the quantity of 2023 as the consumer basket. In order to define the consumer basket, you can use this as the quantity. So solution here is that, as I mentioned, consider the quantity of the base year as the quantity to define the basket. So then accordingly you can calculate the CPI in 2023 as well as CPI in 2024. So using the formula, the inflation formula, you are going to get 38%, that is the inflation. So from this table, what we have summarized here, that looking at this table, the individual value, the inflation rate is that as compared to 2023, in 2024 there is a 38% increase in price level. Let's now move to another price index called wholesale price index. So wholesale price index, it measures prices at the wholesale or producer level. So that is, the WPI measures the average change in prices of goods at the wholesale level, that is before retail sale to consumers. And the WPI, it reflects the price movements in bulk transactions, often between producers and intermediaries. So unlike CPI, it excludes services and focus only on goods. So I have given you a summary, the WPI composition in India, when the government of India estimate wholesale price index. And in this, they have brought three categories of goods and services, mainly goods, that's no service, primary article, fuel, and manufactured goods. And they also give weightage. The largest weightage is given to the manufactured goods in calculating the wholesale price index. So about the coverage and data collection, Government of India collects total items. It tracks around about 676 goods, and accordingly the price quotations from wholesalers, totally it get 5,482 price quotation. Then we take the average, and it has been reported monthly by the Office of the Economic Advisor, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. So some of the key uses of wholesale price index is that it is one of the main input for industrial policy, procurement pricing, and macroeconomic analysis, and still widely referenced, though CPI is the primary index for the monetary policy. So shortly in the next session we will discuss that CPI, initially we have been using wholesale price index as the main measure of inflation, but recently we have shifted to CPI as the primary index for monetary policy and other economic policy making. However, still wholesale price index is still useful because of on these grounds. Now let's move to the last method, the fourth method, that is called producer price index. So this one is an input cost based inflation indicator. So PPI measures the average change in prices received by domestic producers for their output, and it reflects the changes in the cost of production for a typical firm, capturing inflation at an earlier stage. So mainly in the PPI, it includes raw materials and semi-finished goods. So the key features are based on a fixed basket of inputs used by firms, including raw materials, intermediate goods, and energy and fuel inputs. And it focuses on wholesale input prices, not final consumer prices. The focus is mainly for the inputs for producers, mainly intermediate goods, raw materials, and energy and fuel inputs. Let's also highlight why PPI matters. Early indicators, it gives us an early indicator of inflationary pressure in an economy at the production stage itself. So cost increases at the production stage may later appear in retail prices. Obviously, you know that if the cost of production increases, the consumer price also increases. So this has been closely tracked by policymakers, and that is mainly by central banks and businesses for cost forecasting and contract adjustments. So I have made a brief summary what is the distinction between PPI and CPI. This table give a summary of this the distinction between PPI and CPI. So it gives the long-term view here is that while PPI and CPI differ in the short-run trends, not only PPI and CPI, even WPI also. So all these measures differ in short-term trends. They often converge over longer time frames, reflecting similar inflationary forces. So let's conclude this session. In this session, we have defined what is inflation. Then inflation is used, how inflation is measured, how using different indices, depending on what prices are being tracked and whose perspective is considered. Accordingly, we have discussed four measures. One is GDP deflator. Second one is consumer price index. Third one is wholesale price index. And the fourth one is producer price index. And thank you for watching this video, and see you in the next session. Thank you.